February 15, 1978, Pensacola, Florida. The orange Volkswagen Beetle tore down the road, the headlights slicing through the darkness. Behind the wheel was Ted Bundy, one of America's most terrifying serial killers. He was on the edge, broke, hungry, and running out of places to hide. Just days before, he left another victim in his wake, adding to a grim and growing list. Weeks earlier, he'd slaughtered 4 students from Florida State University. A trail of blood, trauma, and death stretched out behind him. Red and blue lights pierced the night behind him. A police cruiser loomed in Bundy's rearview mirror. He barely registered it. After a brief struggle, police officer David Lee wrestled Bundy into the back of his squad car, handcuffs binding his wrists. Lee had no idea that he had just arrested America's most feared man. We'll take you on a disturbing trip through the last day of his life in today's episode of The Infographic Show. The final 24 hours of Ted Bundy. 24 hours left to live. January 23, 1989. Dawn breaks over Florida State Prison. Crowds of people gather outside, braving the morning chill. Some have camped out in a nearby field. They want to be the first to hear that the vilest man in America is dead. A man looks at the morning sun. On his t-shirt are the words, "Burn, Bundy." A girl next to him throws his arms in the air with an almighty yawn. "Ted will fry" are the words printed on her chest. She's waited all night for this moment, along with countless others. It's going to be a long day. 23 hours left to live. Bundy pokes at his breakfast. His appetite has left him. He is tired, drawn out, and has hardly slept for days. Should he tell the truth? Should he clear his sins? He's already told his longtime former girlfriend Liz Klepfer what he is. His nearest and dearest know he's a monster. But there's more. Not just who he killed, but why he did it. He couldn't stop himself. How many women had he murdered? 30, 50, 100? From Seattle to Oregon, Washington, Utah, Idaho, maybe 7 states in all, maybe more. Ted has buried bodies, and only he knows where they are. He knows he is different, crazy even, shampooing dead girls' hair, spending nights beside cold, lifeless bodies. He knows this isn't normal. Today he'll face the inevitable question, what really drove him to cross the line, to delve into the darkest depths of human behavior? He doesn't want to die. He cries like a child thinking about old Sparky, the electric chair that will seal his fate. He needs to see a priest. He puts his head in his arms and cries again under an unsympathetic gaze of the Death Watch guards. 22 hours left to live. Pastor Fred Lawrence appears at the cell door. He's holding a Bible in his hand. It's not the first time Lawrence has ministered to a man on death row. Today he'll be Ted's guide into the afterlife. Lawrence takes a seat in a small holding area next to the cell. "Ted, tell me something about your life in the church growing up," probes Lawrence. Honestly, Ted isn't very religious. He'd written Methodist on his intake form only because he'd attended a few services as a kid. At one point, he was even the Methodist Youth Fellowship's vice president. But he doesn't really believe in God, and God doesn't believe in him. His mind is cast back to his childhood, the secrets, the lies, his mother pretending to be his sister, his violent grandfather, his chronically depressed grandmother. He'll lie about it later. But deep down, he has known all along he was never like the other kids. He once sneaked into his Aunt Julia's bedroom while she slept, knives in his hand, and he slipped them under her blanket. She woke with a scream, his grin only widening as she stared in horror. He knows today he is going to have a very different phone call with his mom. 21 hours left to live. Former detective and now chief criminal investigator Bob Keppel looks at his notes. Yesterday, he interviewed Ted for the final time. Keppel is under no illusion he's dealing with a master manipulator. In that final interview, the debriefing, as Ted's lawyer called it, there were mind games. Out of the 50 or so serial killers Keppel will study in his life, none are as tricky or as demented as Ted Bundy. Ted knows his Keppel interviews were his last chance at securing more years of life for himself. 20 hours left to live. Diane Weiner has stood by Ted as his civil attorney. She is sitting at her desk cluttered with papers on her most notorious client. She can't leave the house without the media hounding her. A few days ago, after another of Ted's grim disclosures, she told the press Ted Bundy feels morally compelled as he faces death to do the right thing. She's hoping, maybe in vain, that the Supreme Court will issue a delay. He's already had 3. 19 hours left to live. In houses all over America, the families of the victims are suffering in silence. Yet outside the prison, there is a carnival atmosphere. More people have turned up. A woman about 40 holds a placard in the air. It reads, "Roast in peace, Ted Bundy." A college student named Nanda Rogers is standing by herself. She is not jeering or laughing like the rest. A reporter asks her why she's there. She replies, her face stern, I believe in the sanctity of human life, even Ted Bundy's life. In that growing crowd, she is a minority of one. During Ted's initial trial, before he escaped for the first time, young women, groupies, sat in the public gallery. Perversely, they'd styled their hair like Ted's young victims. That was when the newspapers were still calling him the All-American Boy. It was before he murdered a schoolgirl in Florida, before he killed a group of sleeping sorority students. 18 hours left to live. Ted sits alone in his cell, shadows creeping along the walls, memories echoing through his mind. He was a Boy Scout once, a psychology student with a promising future. So how did he end up here, trapped with nothing but his own haunting thoughts? He had a promising career in Republican politics in Washington. He'd even had a job as an assistant director at the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee. And that's where he met Ann, his best friend. They chatted all night at work between advising people on the helplines, where Ted would often talk women out of hurting themselves. He'd always watch Ann from the window walk to her car when she left at night. "You can't be too careful," he'd say. "There are bad men around. A killer is on the loose." And it was him. He was the bad man, the baddest of them all. Ann hadn't returned his letters for a long time. She was tired of his bad poetry, of his mind games. She wouldn't ever forgive him. Ted tries to get some sleep. He's got his TV interview coming up. 16 hours left to live. It's time for Ted's final interview, the one he'd rehearsed in his head. He sits across from the Christian psychologist Dr. James Dobson. 6 guards stand around the two men. "For the record, are you guilty?" asks Dobson. "Yes, that's true," replies Ted. Ted then tells Dobson about his wonderful childhood with parents who didn't smoke or gamble in what Ted says was a solid Christian home. It was pornography, Ted says, that must have warped his mind. The lights suddenly go off. "Don't worry," says Ted. "They'll soon come back on. It's because they're testing the electric chair." Ted says he takes full responsibility. He created fantasies and they became darker and darker. It was like an addiction. He had a destructive energy, especially when he applied alcohol on the fire of his fantasies. He said when he returned to the bodies, caressing them, beheading some of them to take as trophies, he was always drunk. Ted doesn't want to take responsibility for his crime. Violence on TV, porn, booze, that's what made him do it. He tells Dobson he'd wake up the next morning disgusted in himself, but he always needed more. "I don't want to die," he says as he lectures Americans on graphic violence in the media. As his former best friend Ann would say, Ted was a human robot, a machine designed to mimic human emotions. For months after this interview, she'll receive letters every day, all from women. "Ted was a good man," they'll say. One girl wrote, "He wouldn't have hurt me. All he needed was some kindness." 14 hours left to live. Liz Klepfer sits at home contemplating Ted's confessions to her. He'd been so sweet at times in their relationship, and then he would switch, his eyes jet black, frightening tunnels she had no intention of ever going down. "I have a sickness," he told her when he finally confessed what he was, "but I don't have a split personality. I don't have blackouts. I remember everything I've done." If that's true, then there is a lot more he can say about his crimes on this final day. 12 hours left to live. Carol Ann Boone, Ted's last lover and biggest supporter throughout his trial, is at home watching TV. It's all about Ted. She believed him for so long. She'd agreed to marry him when he proposed during the trial, taking advantage of a loophole in the law. What was Carol going to tell little Rose when she got older? Rose, barely 6, the product of a prison visit with a man Carol once called kind, warm, and patient. Carol Ann hasn't spoke with Ted for a long time. The illusion is shattered. She sees him for what he is. But she has a plan. Change her surname, take Rose, and escape Bundy's shadow once and for all. 11 hours left to live. Keppel thinks about his interview yesterday. Ted faced him through a window in one of the visitors' rooms. Diane Weiner was there. A tape recorder sat on Ted's side. Ted looked even paler under the room's sickly lime green light, but that unfamiliar, unsettling smile still flickered across his face. Ted trusted Keppel, but Keppel didn't trust him, not one bit. "There's another body," said Ted. He described burying her on Taylor Mountain near the others. "Donna Manson. I picked her up at Evergreen State College." He told Keppel the femur the detectives had found at another site was from Georgiana Hawkins. This case had haunted Keppel for years. Hawkins had vanished so easily. Ted was waiting for Hawkins in the shadows of a dark alley. Ted explained he was on crutches that night faking a broken leg. So many of his victims had fallen for this ploy. In his articulate, charismatic way, he asked her to help him carry his briefcase. When they got to his car, he hit her with a tire iron as she made the mistake of turning her back on him. Ted looked pained as he explained that she was alive and quiet. Keppel listened, the tape recorder whirring. Ted recounted Hawkins' struggle. his voice chillingly calm as he explained how she became animated on the way to her fate. "To cut a long story short," Ted said with a small, unsettling smile, "I hit her again. Then he strangled her." Then Ted turned to the girls from Lake Sammamish. He lured them with a smile, his shiny white tennis shoes, his relaxed summer shorts. "There weren't just 2 bodies there," he told Keppel, his voice barely audible. "There were 3. And then, unexpectedly, Ted's eyes filled with tears. Keppel watched, wary. Were they real? Was this part of the act? Tears trailed down Ted's face, his voice cracking as he whispered, "There are more." The interview was ending. Time was up. As Ted was escorted back to his cell, Keppel headed for a phone in the visiting area, his mind still racing. He dialed his superior, his voice tense. "There are more," he said. He's still holding back. He's trying to save his own life. There were at least 100 bodies, Keppel was sure of it. The man once voted the shyest boy in class at junior high school was a predator without equal. With hours left until Ted's execution, Keppel felt a gnawing frustration. If only he had more time, he could get the rest of the truth. 8 hours left to live. Ted's back in his cell, his head resting against the cold bars. He's heard phones ringing all day and night. The Supreme Court could stop this. Surely he'd given Keppel enough to get the delay that he so dearly wants. Outside, detectives work against the clock. They've combed through the burial sites Ted mentioned, but several feet of snow hide any sign of evidence. In Seattle, officers scour neighborhoods searching for a Tiger 10-speed bike, serial number 290, linked to one of his victims. 7 hours left to live. At Florida State University, the air is thick with smoke from the cookout. Students have gathered laughing and cheering under a banner that reads, "Watch Ted fry, see Ted die." They're flipping Bundy burgers on the grill and handing out electrified hot dogs. Chi-Fi House, where Ted murdered 2 young women and left 2 more gravely injured, is mere steps away. For some, Bundy burgers and hot dogs are an insult to the suffering of these young women. 5 hours left to live. It's time for Ted to call his mother, Louise, and tell her that he loves her. He's sorry he hurt her. It's his fault. She did nothing wrong. "Mom," he says, "the Ted you knew, he always existed." He tries to call Carol, no answer. He tries again, same. He can't handle the rejection, so he makes another call to his mom. "You'll always be my precious son," she tells him, her hand cupping the receiver to shield the noise in her busy house. 4 hours left to live. Outside the prison, hundreds of reporters and TV news crews are wondering what's taking so long. He was supposed to be dead by now. 3 hours left to live. "Can you read to me?" asks Ted. Pastor Lawrence pulls out a poem he'd written. For the first time in days, a hint of peace softens Ted's haunted face. His eyes drift shut, his tense body loosening ever so slightly. A guard suddenly appears. It's time for the last meal. Ted is asked for steak and eggs. He doesn't touch any of it. 2 hours left to live. Ted has his last meeting with his attorney, Polly Nelson. She's tried everything to save Ted's life. She knows he is sick, but killing people who kill people she believes is wrong. On this last visit, Ted lays his head in her hands. She feels sorry for him as his handcuffs cut into his wrists. She'll later write, "I had never been this way with Ted before, touching him, comforting him, but today was very, very different." This was the same man Keppel will say was a black hole, a destructive force that drew people in and swallowed them whole. This force was strong, it was irresistible to some. Polly has to leave. She'll later explain, "To my amazement, I was propelled against the glass to kiss and hug Ted, as best we could. I didn't know how I got there. It was a force from within, beyond my control. I walked out the door and I burst into tears." 1 hour left to live. Lawrence takes his communion kit and blesses the wafer and the wine. After the sacrament, he and Ted bow their heads in silent prayer. Before Lawrence leaves for the last time, he tells Ted what will happen in the execution chamber. The last words, the hood, the straps, the headpiece. Ted almost breaks down weeping. "You'll hear a loud noise," says Lawrence. "It's just circuits being opened. You won't feel pain." Tears stream down Ted's cheeks. Lawrence puts a hand inside the cell and warmly holds Ted's hand in his. "I'd never had my hands held that tight," Lawrence will later say. Lawrence promises Ted that when they throw the switch, he'll be there watching. What he's doing now with his hand around Ted's, he'll be doing with his mind the moment Ted dies. Moments left to live. Ted is led to the execution chamber by a group of guards. Outside, people are partying. Someone is handing out donuts. A camera focuses on a man drunk from celebrating. When he realizes he's being photographed, he proudly stretches the front of his shirt, which says, "I like my Ted, well done." It's time. 42 people are sitting on white chairs in the observation room, looking into the execution chamber. Ted, dazed on tranquilizers, arrives in handcuffs wearing blue slacks and a pale blue prison-issue shirt. Ted doesn't know most of the observers, mainly cops, detectives, and journalists. Superintendent Tom Barton asks if Ted has any last words. Looking at his attorney, Jim Coleman, and Pastor Lawrence, he says, "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." He's composed but slightly shaking. As Ted sits in the chair, they secure the thick straps around his legs. His wrists, one leg, and his head are shaved, exposing bare skin where the electrodes will be attached. The electrodes are positioned to ensure he'll receive the full blast of 2,000 volts coursing through his body. The room is silent, each second drawing closer to the inevitable. As the straps on the headplate are tightened, there is fear in his face. A phone is in one corner of the room, but Ted hasn't looked at it once. Barton makes a call to Governor Bob Martinez. He hangs up the receiver and nods to the executioner. The executioner hits the switch. In less than 2 minutes, it's over. Silence settles heavily over the room as a paramedic steps forward to check Ted's pulse. Dr. Frank Kilgo appears, removing the hood from Ted's face. His lifeless eyes stare blankly ahead, fixed in one final empty gaze. Kilgo turns to the witnesses, some stunned, others visibly relieved. He's dead. It's exactly 7:16 a.m. Outside, the news spreads like wildfire. He's gone. TV crews begin packing up, their cameras still warm. Journalists head to their cars, their notebooks filled with shorthand scrawls. In terms of viewer numbers, it's been a very good day. Later, a white hearse pulls out of the prison gates. For the roaring crowd, it is the end of the party. For the victims' families, the nightmare never ends. What do you think? Is Ted Bundy the most terrifying monster in American history? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Now you need to hear the full Bundy tale and how they caught Ted Bundy day by day. Or see how Ted would get on today. And what if Ted Bundy was alive today?